Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about greenhouses, which I feel like are misnamed. They should be called glass houses because that's what they generally are. These structures, ranging in size and shape from small enough to fit on your porch to larger than a Walmart supercenter by about 50% in square feet, in the case of the Eden Project in the UK, they exist to create a more controlled environment from which to grow things, very often having an internal environment or climate different than what's outside of it. The general concept of them goes as far back as the Roman Empire, where, according to Natural History by Pliny the Elder, cucumbers were placed inside primitive greenhouses made of mirror stone in the winter, which might have been made of mica, a relatively translucent mineral that forms glass-like panes. And it is very glass-like if you've never seen mica in person before. It usually just looks like some dirty glass. I almost bought some before then realizing I didn't actually know where I'd put it to keep it safe. But anyway, greenhouses. Why are we talking about greenhouses? Well, quite simply, there's a plane designed and made early in World War II that I immediately thought looks like if you slap some wings on a greenhouse and called it a day. With it having so much glass, you would think that it was for recon or something similar, but no, this was a plane with a cockpit canopy that goes from engine nearly to tail that was to serve in direct combat as a torpedo bomber, likely coming under direct fire from enemy ship, machine guns, and/or cannons. This is the Flying Greenhouse. That was also probably the unluckiest plane of World War II. This is the Consolidated TBY Sea Wolf, but it could also be called the Vought TBU Sea Wolf, for reasons that we'll shortly get into. Back in October 1939, World War II having just started the month prior, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics sent out a design request proposal to various aircraft manufacturers for a new torpedo bomber design that would be replacing the once technological marvel Douglas TBD Devastator. That plane, designed in 1934 and first flown in 1935, was actually quite the solid plane for its time, hitting a top speed upwards of 206 miles an hour, and with a payload of one torpedo, or around 1,000 pounds of explosives. But by the time 1939 rolled around, though, the Navy recognized that they needed to improve it, and by 1942, after a catastrophic performance in the Battle of Midway, the Devastator was retired immediately. In their recognition of the Devastator's faults, the U.S. Navy wanted a design that had greater speed, armor, and max payload. The top speed was to be upwards of 300 miles an hour, with the ability to carry either one torpedo or up to 1,500 pounds of explosives, and it was to have greater armor around the fuel tanks, and just greater armor in general, along with having at least one dorsal-mounted turret. While several companies would send in designs, by April 1940, just 2 of them would receive contracts for a prototype. Vought would receive a contract for their XTBU design, and Grumman would receive one for their TBF Avenger design. The TBF Avenger would be using the Wright R2600 Twin Cyclone, a radial air-cooled engine weighing around 2,000 pounds and having 1,700 horsepower to its name. The Sea Wolf, on the other hand, was designed to use the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, weighing around 2,300 pounds and having between 1,800 and 2,100 horsepower. Now, in April 1940, the R2800 was far less proven an engine than the R2600, but development of the Sea Wolf would take time, enough time for the R2800 to prove itself, so its selection of this engine didn't really have a detrimental bearing at this time, and if the R2800 performed well enough in production aircraft, that would actually boost the Sea Wolf design. The Sea Wolf would also have a very slightly better armament in its guns, but the key part of the armament in the payload was basically the same as the Avenger. Both models would have two different forward-firing armament arrangements in their career. Early on, the Avenger had just a single 30 caliber machine gun in the nose, which even for 1939-1940 was pretty outdated. American aircraft generally seem to have shifted over to the 50 cal at this point. Later on the Avenger, this was removed and swapped out with two 50 caliber machine guns in the wings. For the Sea Wolf, it would have both guns in the nose and guns in the wings later on. One in the nose, two in the wings, all 50 cal. But initially, it was still stronger than the Avenger, with just a single 50 caliber machine gun in the nose. The rear-firing guns and payload on both models were basically the same though, with one 50 cal in the dorsal position, one 30 cal in the ventral position, and the ability to carry one torpedo or 2,000 pounds of explosives underneath. Then, for a probably very important design difference, in that each plane was to be on aircraft carriers, the way that each of their wings folded was different. For the Sea Wolf, the folding mechanism was pretty simple and standard, with a pivot point around mid-wing, and the wings would fold upwards. This would help reduce the wingspan by more than half in this state, going from 17.35 meters to just 8.38 meters. For the Avenger, on the other hand, Grumman would use their own patented design called the stow wing, which placed the pivot point further towards the wing root and had it twist inwards, making the wing almost parallel with the fuselage. While potentially more mechanically complex, it would help reduce the wingspan even more than your conventional folding wings, with the Avenger wingspan going from 16.51 meters to just 5.79 meters, a reduction close to just a third of the original span. Just think of it this way, in the normal wingspan of the Sea Wolf, you could have two folded-wing Sea Wolves in that area. In the same span, you could have three Avengers. In their more compact forms, you could basically have 50% more Avengers than Sea Wolves in the same space, a pretty remarkable difference. On carriers like the Yorktown-class carriers, with the flight deck being 33.38 meters wide, just under 4 Sea Wolves in their folded form could fit side by side, where just under 6 Avengers would fit in the same space. Also, it should be said that the length and height of each plane was about the same, roughly around 12 meters long and 5 meters tall. Ultimately, though, while important, the space-saving aspect would be secondary or even tertiary to two more important factors: performance and production capabilities. In these two factors, each plane would be better than the other in one of them, but one of the factors is more important than the other. The Avenger would be the first to fly on August 7, 1941, and its performance would be mixed, leaning more towards the poor side. While the Navy wanted 300 miles an hour, the Avenger would max out at around 275. This wasn't terrible, but for the rest of its performance, it was actually kinda bad, being too heavy, having its center of gravity off-center, and just generally being unstable. The Avenger was off to a kinda poor start, and this would set a low bar for the Sea Wolf to clear. 4 months later, on December 22, 1941, just over 2 weeks after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and drew America into direct participation in the war, the Sea Wolf would take to the air and perform much better than the Avenger did. It would end up posting a top speed upwards of 311 miles an hour, and overall it just handled much better. It also had a unique design feature that the Avenger did not have, that would make landing on carriers much easier. With just a singular control, the plane's control surfaces would be set up for landing, lowering the landing gear, moving the flaps, altering propeller pitch, and even changing the fuel mixture, All things that the pilot would normally have to do individually, he could now do basically with the push of a button. Additionally, with its extended canopy, that at this stage actually extended even further into the tail section, gave the crew of 3 excellent vision all around, with plenty of room to move within. The big canopy basically made the plane more comfortable. Performance was overall solid, noted by the Navy to be better than the Avenger, and an order for 1,000 models was placed, under the condition that the Sea Wolf pass carrier testing. This carrier testing phase, though, is where the Sea Wolf started to encounter problems. At this stage, in early 1942, the Avenger had already been ordered in smaller numbers and was in production. In fact, the Avenger actually got a production contract several months before it ever flew, because I guess the Navy was just desperate. So, because the Avenger was already well underway, the Sea Wolf would have to have everything go absolutely perfectly to be adopted and potentially replace the Avenger. And the exact opposite happened. Everything went wrong. Around March 1942, the Sea Wolf was undergoing a carrier landing test. The whole flying element of the test went fine. No mention of anything wrong with the single control landing system either. The problem came after the wheels touched pavement and the tailhook touched a resting cable. There was a then unknown weakness in the frame of the Sea Wolf. So when the cable began slowing the plane down, the force of that ripped the entire plane in half, with the front half just continuing to roll down the runway. This would certainly put a damper on things, and put the Sea Wolf even further behind the Avenger. But still, all things considered, it wasn't that big of a deal. Just a month after the lone prototype was destroyed, Vought managed to put it back together, strengthen the frame, and have it ready to go back into testing. The very day that the repairs were finished, though, the Sea Wolf was being pushed back into its hangar, while a Navy cadet was using a training aircraft. Under normal circumstances, these two things had no connection. But after the cadet lost control while still on the ground taxiing, the two things very much had a literal connection. The training aircraft slammed into the newly rebuilt Sea Wolf, destroying its tail section again. This would once again delay the Sea Wolf until it could be once again repaired. But still, it wouldn't actually take too long to repair it, and after that it would fly and have things go pretty well, being officially accepted by the Navy by mid-1943. Finally, the Sea Wolf could go into production. At least in theory. In actuality, it wouldn't go into production for a few months because Vought was too busy. To be fair, all major companies were pretty busy at this time, and Vought was just no exception. A year prior, in 1942, Vought began production on their carrier-based fighter design, the F-4U Corsair, a plane certainly in the upper echelon of fighter aircraft in the war, and demand for that plane was very high. From 1942 to 1953, over 12,000 Corsairs would be built, but during the war, Vought simply did not have the production capabilities to meet demand, so they had to outsource. Of the roughly 12,000 total Corsairs made over its lifetime, only about 8,000 of them came from Vought. The rest were contracted out to Brewster, albeit in smaller numbers, under 1,000, and Goodyear, who actually accounted for a third of the total production run. In fact, at peak production of the Corsair in May 1944, where 596 of them were made in 1 month, Vought made less than half of them with 254. Goodyear would make 220, and Brewster 122. This is all to say that adding another plane to their production lines was simply not something that they could handle. They did not have the ability to produce the 1,000 plus requested Sea Wolves in a reasonable time frame, unless the military was somehow cool with just a handful being made per month for the next 50 years. So now the question would be, who would be making the Sea Wolf, if anybody would actually be making it at all? Grumman's Avenger was coming into its own around this time as at least a pretty serviceable torpedo bomber, so would there really be that much value in adding another new torpedo bomber into the fold? The military seemed to think so, but most other companies were again preoccupied. Republic Aviation was invested in their P-47 Thunderbolt, Lockheed in their P-38 Lightning, and other planes they had under contract. North American had the P-51 Mustang and B-25 Mitchell, etc., etc., etc. In the end, it was decided that Consolidated Aircraft, or Consolidated Vought TBU in 1943, would be the ones making the Sea Wolf. Having over 40,000 employees by 1943, and largely just producing the B-24 Liberator at this time, Consolidated was probably the best choice at this point, likely having the capital and manpower to absorb the project. But what they didn't have at this point, though, was factory space, and the Sea Wolf would have to wait yet again to the end of the year until a new factory was completed in Pennsylvania that would house it. But finally, by late 1943, early 1944, about 2 years after first flying, the Sea Wolf was on the production line, and would ideally be reaching active units by the end of 1944. Also, it should be said that the full name of the Sea Wolf would change after falling under the purview of Consolidated. The XTBU would turn into the TBY, and the first production variant would be the TBY2. The TBY1 would be the baseline model that followed the prototype design, but none of these were actually made. Instead, the 2 variant was the main model that saw the addition of a radar pod mounted on the wing. Also around this time, the Sea Wolf would gain the 2 extra .50 caliber machine guns in its wings. Production of the Sea Wolf was slow though, and the first Consolidated produced model wouldn't take to the air until August 20th, 1944. And even then, there were issues with the design. While I couldn't find specifics, Consolidated being kind of new to the design, and presumably making some small design changes of their own, this led to small issues that, while not deal breakers, would certainly have to be worked out. This put the Sea Wolf into an almost impossible uphill battle against its old rival, the Avenger. The Avenger was already firmly entrenched as the Navy's torpedo bomber, and even then, designated torpedo bombers were on their way out in favor of multi-role aircraft. Something drastic would have to happen for the Sea Wolf to make any kind of mark in World War II. Unfortunately for it, that drastic thing never happened. The first Sea Wolves would be delivered in early November 1944, and they wouldn't even make their way to actual combat units until April 1945, being delivered to Torpedo Squadron 97. The next month, the end of the European theater of the war signaled that the war as a whole may be drawing to a close. The Pacific theater was still going on, but with America being able to place their full attention on that theater, plus having the Soviets join the fold too, it was only a matter of time before Imperial Japan was defeated. This meant that new aircraft like the Sea Wolf would have even less effort placed into its production. By the time the war in the Pacific ended in August, about 180 of the original 1,000 plus Sea Wolves had been made and sent to units. This is where the production of the Sea Wolf would end. With the war over, the contract was cancelled in September, and the other 820 plus Sea Wolves would never come to fruition. Also not coming to fruition would be an upgraded variant called the TBY3, of which 600 of them were ordered at some point. When exactly they were ordered and what was different about them, I'm not sure. I imagine they had a bit more power and carrying capacity. This order was also cancelled in September. With the war over, the existing Sea Wolves were spread around several U.S. military bases to be used both as training aircraft and reserve aircraft. The only real chance that they would have at seeing combat is basically if World War II suddenly reignited out of nowhere, or something equally unlikely. In reserve duty, the Sea Wolves would languish until the late 40s until they were removed from reserve duty and most likely scrapped. None of these Sea Wolves made exist today, none to be used as makeshift artistic greenhouses. So with basically the entire history of the Sea Wolf being beset with horrible luck, it does make you wonder what would have happened if the first prototype wasn't ripped in half, or if the repaired model wasn't destroyed again. Let's figure a best-case scenario, assuming that the first flight date of the model stays the same. How would the career of the Sea Wolf have gone? To be honest, I don't think things would have gone that much different. While the plane being destroyed twice was certainly a detriment to its success, I think the bigger obstacles were the Grumman Avenger and Vought's own production capabilities. With the Avenger already much further along, even without all of the mishaps, the Sea Wolf's performance would really have to be a major improvement over the Avenger. Plus, the Avenger would show that it really needed improving on. Let's assume that the Sea Wolf passed its carrier test back in March 1942. It would likely be the end of the year that they would start appearing in arsenals, and a bit longer after that they would start seeing combat. So let's say early 1943. Again, by this time, the Avenger was improving and performing pretty capably, so there wasn't much of a need for an improved torpedo bomber even then. Even if the Sea Wolf was an improvement, was it really worth it? I'm not sure. Plus, consider that in 1943, Grumman actually moved away from making the Avenger, instead outsourcing it and moving into making the F-6F Hellcat fighter. I think that this shows that the Navy wanted more and better carrier-based fighters, and as Vought had their F-4U Corsair design, I think even if Vought started making the Sea Wolf before the Corsair somehow, they would have inevitably shifted over to making the Corsairs as their primary focus. This means that the Sea Wolf 2 would have to be outsourced, and if we assume that Consolidated got the contract again, they would still in all likelihood be waiting for that new factory in Pennsylvania, and that just ends up making the timeline just about identical to what it was in reality. The Sea Wolf would still be produced rather slowly by Consolidated. It would still have to have its initial faults worked out, and it still would have been cancelled. Honestly, I think the best case scenario for the Sea Wolf is that it managed some production by Vought before going to Consolidated. This would give the Sea Wolf more of a chance to participate in combat and potentially showcase its better performance. While I don't think it would have replaced the Avenger, I still think it could have complemented it, and potentially served in some other roles as well. With its excellent vision from the cockpit, perhaps it would serve decently as a recon aircraft, or perhaps its more powerful engine would help it serve as an attack aircraft, or maybe a light bomber type aircraft. Even in these best case scenarios, the Sea Wolf was probably doomed to be at best a niche complementary aircraft. Because of a combination of poor luck and Grumman just being quicker on the draw, they wouldn't even be able to manage that, making the Consolidated TBY Sea Wolf kind of one of these sadder stories of the war, a plane that was pretty good on paper, doomed by things that were out of its control. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So, with the name Sea Wolf, what I want to know is why exactly they called it that. There is a wolf called the Sea Wolf, but it mostly lives in Western Canada. It feels kind of weird to use a Canadian animal for an American plane. Maybe they should have called it the leopard shark or the sea eagle. Steal that one from Britain. Or maybe the anchovy. I like the anchovy. It's at least a little bit funnier. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.